Do you think you belong here? With a chain like that? Must have been stolen. The officer's words sliced through the air like a knife. It started at a gas station, a busy afternoon where the world moved fast, except for one man. His hands shook slightly as he filled his tank, the faint shine of a gold chain glinting under the sunlight. It wasn't just jewelry, it was a piece of history, a story, a connection to someone long gone. He had worked tirelessly to keep it close to his heart, but today, that symbol of pride would be stripped from him in the cruelest way. The officer's car screeched to a halt just feet away. A casual glance turned into a glare, then an accusation. "Step away from the pump," the officer barked, his tone laced with disdain. The man froze. Confusion washed over him. "What's the problem, officer?" he asked, his voice steady but cautious. "That chain around your neck," the officer sneered, pointing. "Where'd you get it?" The word stung, the implication louder than the question itself. For a moment, the man hesitated. Should he explain its meaning? Would it even matter? He decided on truth. "It belonged to my father," he replied, his voice firm. "I've had it for years." The officer's laughter was cold. "Yeah, right. Let me guess, it just fell into your hands." People around the station began to slow down, their curiosity piqued by the escalating scene. The man felt their eyes on him, and with each passing second, the weight of humiliation grew. "I don't have to explain myself to you," he said finally, his pride refusing to buckle. But the officer wasn't done. "That's not how this works. Hand it over. Now." The man's jaw tightened. "I'm not giving you anything." And then it happened. Quick as a flash, the officer reached forward and yanked the chain from his neck. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The man stumbled back, a mixture of disbelief and rage filling his chest. He could hardly believe what had just happened, but the cold emptiness around his neck was undeniable. "You can pick it up at the station after we verify it's not stolen," the officer spat, slipping the chain into his pocket with a smirk. The man stared, his fists clenched at his sides, his pride and dignity lying shattered at his feet. The officer turned on his heel, heading back to his car, radiating power and smug satisfaction. The onlookers whispered amongst themselves, their words a mix of pity and fear. But just as the officer reached for his car door, something changed. A black SUV screeched into the lot, tires screeching. Out stepped a man in a suit, his badge gleaming under the sun. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his tone sharp and unyielding. The officer turned, his expression faltering for the briefest moment before slipping back into arrogance. "Just handling business," he replied, motioning toward the man still standing by the pump. The man in the suit didn't buy it. He turned to the victim, his eyes narrowing. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. The man hesitated, but he nodded. "He took my chain," he said quietly, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and humiliation. The man in the suit's jaw tightened. "He did what?" For the first time, the officer looked uneasy. "It's procedure." "He couldn't prove it was his," he said quickly, avoiding eye contact. The man in the suit stepped closer, his presence commanding. "Let me see it." The officer's hesitation was telling. Slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the chain. But as he held it up, the man in the suit's expression darkened. "You just made the biggest mistake of your career," he said, his voice low but filled with fury. The officer's face paled. "I was just, save it," the man in the suit cut him off. "This isn't over." The officer's smirk had vanished. Now, it was replaced with something else, fear. The crowd around them had grown, their murmurs growing louder. The man in the suit turned to the victim, his tone softening. "We'll make this right. I promise." But how? And what could possibly happen next that would bring justice for such blatant cruelty? The wheels of karma were already in motion, but the road ahead was more shocking than anyone could have imagined. What would happen to the officer who thought he was untouchable? What secrets would be revealed, and what consequences would he face for his abuse of power? Stay with us, because this story is far from over. The scales of justice have a way of tipping in ways no one can predict. And what happens next will leave you speechless. At Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against racism and discrimination in any form. This channel is a space of respect, equity, and powerful stories that amplify voices and experiences often overlooked. To our Black audience and all allies, we support you, and we dedicate this story to highlighting the importance of justice and resilience. Get ready for an emotional and thought-provoking journey. If you enjoy stories that pack a punch, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and let's dive in. Here's to an unforgettable story. The sun was relentless that afternoon, casting a golden hue over the small gas station on the outskirts of Atlanta. It was a modest place, one of those family-owned businesses that had survived against the odds, its pumps a little worn, its convenience store stocked with essentials and local charm. Cars came and went, drivers refueling on their way to somewhere else, but for James Carter, this was a routine stop on his way home from his shift at the warehouse. James was in his late 50s, with weathered hands that spoke of decades of hard work. His tall frame was still strong, though his back carried the slight stoop of a man who'd labored through life. His face, etched with lines of wisdom and struggle, radiated kindness, even when his heart carried the weight of countless injustices he'd endured. Around his neck, always visible over his neatly pressed work shirt, was the gold chain. It wasn't flashy, it was simple, elegant, and deeply personal. The chain had belonged to his father, a man who had fought tirelessly for civil rights in the South. To James, it wasn't just jewelry, it was a piece of his family's legacy, a symbol of resilience passed from one generation to the next. He parked his old but reliable Chevy at one of the pumps, humming to himself as he stepped out. His movements were deliberate, years of lifting, bending, and hauling had made even simple actions a little slower. He began filling the tank, glancing occasionally at the convenience store window where the young clerk, barely out of high school, was chatting on her phone. For James, moments like these, mundane but peaceful, were what kept him going. Unbeknownst to James, a patrol car had pulled into the lot moments earlier. Officer Mark Hendricks was in his mid-40s, a man with a square jaw, piercing blue eyes, and a presence that demanded attention. He had been with the force for nearly 2 decades, long enough to climb the ranks but not without controversy. Hendricks had a reputation. Among his colleagues, he was known as a no-nonsense enforcer, but within the community, particularly among the Black residents, his name evoked fear and anger. His approach to policing often blurred the line between authority and abuse, and he thrived on the power that came with his badge. Hendricks wasn't even supposed to be at the gas station. He had been on patrol in a neighboring area but decided to stop for a coffee. As he stepped out of his car, his gaze landed on James. Something about the older man immediately irritated him. Perhaps it was the chain that gleamed in the sunlight, or maybe it was the quiet confidence James carried in his demeanor, something Hendricks perceived as a challenge. Hendricks entered the convenience store, his boots heavy against the tiled floor, but his eyes kept darting back to the man at the pump. James seemed oblivious to the scrutiny, his focus on the task at hand. The officer lingered near the coffee station, pouring himself a cup, but his mind was already spinning. There was a story in his head, a justification for the confrontation he was itching to initiate. To Hendricks, James didn't belong in his narrative of order, and that chain. That was the final provocation. Meanwhile, James finished at the pump, securing the gas cap before glancing at the small receipt that printed from the machine. His day had been long, and he was looking forward to a quiet evening at home. The chain around his neck caught the light as he moved, and for a fleeting moment, he thought of his father, of the stories that chain represented. He smiled to himself, a rare moment of contentment. As James climbed back into his truck, Hendricks emerged from the store, his coffee forgotten. The officer's heavy boots echoed on the concrete as he approached. He didn't announce himself immediately, instead walking slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the moment. James noticed him out of the corner of his eye but didn't think much of it, until he heard the words. "Hey, you!" Hendricks barked, his voice sharp and commanding. James turned, confused. "Yes, officer. Is there a problem?" "That chain," Hendricks said, pointing. "Where'd you get it?" The question, laced with accusation, caught James off guard. "It was my father's," he replied, his tone even. "I've had it for years." Hendricks stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "Funny. Doesn't look like something a guy like you could afford." The insult was blatant, the implication clear. James felt the weight of the officer's words, a familiar sting of humiliation he thought he'd learned to endure. But this time, something was different. There was a crowd. People were watching, drivers at other pumps, a mother with her child near the vending machines, the young clerk now peering out from behind the counter. Their eyes were on him, and James felt the heat of their stares. "Excuse me," James said, his voice firmer now. "You heard me," Hendricks replied, taking another step closer. "Take it off. Now." The demand hit like a slap. James's chest tightened. He had been through enough in his life to know when to choose his battles, but this? This was too much. "I'm not giving you my chain," James said, his tone calm but resolute. Hendricks smirked, his hand hovering near his belt. "That's not how this works, old man. Either you hand it over, or I'll take it." The tension was suffocating. James looked around, searching for someone to intervene, but the onlookers remained silent. He knew what they were thinking: if they stepped in, they might be next. So James stood his ground, his fists clenched at his sides, his heart pounding. "I'm not giving you anything," he repeated. Hendricks's smirk faded. Without another word, he reached out and yanked the chain from James's neck. The gold link snapped, the sound echoing in the stillness. James stumbled back, a mixture of shock and fury coursing through him. "This is evidence," Hendricks said, slipping the chain into his pocket. "You can pick it up at the station after we verify it's not stolen." James stared at the officer, his dignity stripped along with the chain. He wanted to fight, to scream, to demand justice, but the futility of the moment crushed him. Hendricks turned, walking back toward his patrol car, his victory evident in the swagger of his steps. As the officer climbed into his car, James stood frozen, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. The crowd began to disperse, their silence louder than any words. But just as Hendricks reached for the ignition, a black SUV pulled into the lot, its presence demanding attention. The door opened, and out stepped a man in a sharp suit, his badge visible on his belt. James recognized him immediately: his son, Michael Carter, a field agent for the FBI. "What's going on here?" Michael asked, his voice calm but authoritative. The look on Hendricks's face shifted, but he masked it quickly, replying, "Just doing my job." Michael's gaze moved to his father, then to the broken chain in Hendricks's pocket. "Looks like we've got a problem, officer," Michael said, his tone icy. "And it's bigger than you think." Michael Carter stood in the middle of the gas station lot, his sharp eyes narrowing as he surveyed the scene. The air was thick with tension, and the remnants of the broken chain glinting in Officer Hendricks' pocket made his blood boil. This wasn't just a matter of principle, it was personal. He took a deep breath, willing himself to remain calm as he turned to his father. "Dad," Michael said quietly, his tone both concerned and firm, "are you okay?" James Carter nodded, though his shoulders sagged under the weight of humiliation. "I'm fine," he muttered, but his voice betrayed him. There was a tremble there, a vulnerability that Michael hadn't heard in years. James had always been a man of pride and quiet strength, but this was different. Michael turned his attention to Hendricks, his FBI badge now fully visible as he let it dangle conspicuously from his belt. Officer, he began, his voice colder now, you want to explain to me why you're holding my father's chain? Hendrik straightened, his smug expression faltering for a split second before he found his footing again. Your father, he repeated, feigning surprise. I had no idea. He was acting suspicious, and I have reason to believe that chain might be stolen property. Michael's jaw tightened. Suspicious? Filling up his truck at a gas station? Hendrik shrugged, his smirk returning. We're trained to notice certain behaviors. The chain seemed out of place. Out of place. The words hung in the air like a slap. Michael's father's expression darkened, but he remained silent, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Michael, however, wasn't about to let it slide. Out of place. Michael repeated, his voice rising slightly. Let me be very clear. That chain isn't just a piece of jewelry. It's a family heirloom. And you had no right to lay a hand on him, let alone take it. Hendrik scoffed, but his confidence wavered under Michael's unwavering stare. Look, the officer said, taking a step back, I was just doing my job. If the chain's his, he can pick it up from the station after we run it through our system. Michael stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous tone. You think I don't know the game you're playing? You've got a badge, and you think that gives you the power to humiliate people like my father? To treat him like a criminal for existing in a space you don't think he belongs in? Hendricks opened his mouth to respond, but Michael wasn't done. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to hand over that chain, right now, and then you're going to explain to me why you thought this was an acceptable use of your authority. The crowd that had gathered earlier was smaller now, but those who remained watched in silence. Some recorded on their phones, the light of their screens catching Hendricks' eye. He shifted uncomfortably, the weight of their attention pressing down on him. This isn't over, Hendricks muttered, reluctantly pulling the chain from his pocket. He held it out to Michael, who took it with a measured calm that belied the storm brewing inside him. You're right, Michael said evenly, slipping the chain into his own pocket. It's not. Later that evening, Michael sat across from his father in the small, modest kitchen of James' home. The chain lay on the table between them, its broken clasp a stark reminder of the day's events. James hadn't said much since they'd left the gas station, and Michael could see the weight of the incident settling heavily on him. Dad, Michael said gently, breaking the silence, you didn't deserve that. None of it. James sighed, his fingers tracing the edges of the chain. It's not the first time, he admitted, his voice weary. And it won't be the last. Men like him, they think they can take whatever they want. Our pride, our dignity, even this. Michael felt a surge of anger. It doesn't have to be this way, he said firmly. I'm going to make sure he answers for what he did. James looked up, his eyes meeting Michael's. And how are you going to do that? Men like him always have an excuse. They've got the system on their side. Michael leaned forward, his determination burning bright. Maybe he has the system on his side, but he doesn't know who he's dealing with. I've spent my career uncovering people like him, tearing apart the lies they build their power on. I'm not going to let this slide. James hesitated. He admired his son's resolve, but he'd seen enough of the world to know how these battles often ended. Just be careful, he said finally. This fight, it's bigger than you think. Michael nodded, but his mind was already racing. Hendricks had made a critical mistake, and Michael was going to ensure he paid for it, not just for his father, but for every person who had ever been humiliated, demeaned, or silenced by men like him. The next day, Michael arrived at his office, a bustling FBI field division in downtown Atlanta. He wasted no time, diving into Hendricks' record. What he found was both unsurprising and infuriating. Complaints of excessive force, racial profiling, and abuse of authority peppered his file, but they had all been buried under layers of bureaucracy. The officer had connections in high places, shields that had protected him from consequences for years. Michael wasn't deterred. He began making calls, reaching out to colleagues, gathering evidence. Each piece he uncovered painted a clearer picture of a man who had used his badge as a weapon against the very people he was sworn to protect. By midday, Michael had what he needed to escalate the case. He sat in a conference room with his team, laying out the evidence. "Hendricks isn't just a bad cop," he said, his voice steady but fierce. "He's a liability. And it's time we held him accountable." His team listened intently, their faces reflecting the gravity of the situation. "What's the next step?" one of them asked. Michael's lips curved into a determined smile. "We build the case, brick by brick. And when we're done, we make sure he has nowhere to hide." Meanwhile, Hendricks was beginning to feel the pressure. Word of the gas station incident had spread, and the videos circulating online weren't helping his case. He had always prided himself on being untouchable, but now, cracks were forming in his armor. The whispers among his colleagues, the sidelong glances, it was enough to make even him uneasy. But Hendricks wasn't the type to back down. He began working to cover his tracks, calling in favors, trying to discredit anyone who might pose a threat to him. He thought he could outmaneuver whatever storm was brewing. What he didn't know was that Michael was already 3 steps ahead, and the storm he was trying to avoid was far more devastating than he could imagine. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, Michael prepared for the confrontation that would change everything. The truth was coming, and with it, a reckoning Hendricks could never have anticipated. The precinct was buzzing. Phones rang incessantly, officers shuffled papers, and the low hum of chatter filled the room. Yet, as Michael Carter walked through the double doors, his presence demanded attention. Dressed sharply in a tailored suit, his FBI badge clipped to his belt, he carried an air of authority that silenced conversations mid-sentence. All eyes turned toward him, and the tension in the room thickened as he approached the front desk. "I need to speak to Officer Hendricks," Michael said, his voice calm but firm. The desk sergeant, a stout man with graying hair, shifted uncomfortably. "Hendricks isn't here right now. Can I help you with something?" Michael leaned in slightly, locking eyes with the sergeant. "This isn't a request. I need him here. Now." The sergeant hesitated, then picked up the phone. As he dialed, Michael's eyes scanned the room. A few officers avoided his gaze, their body language betraying unease. Others exchanged wary glances, whispering under their breath. Michael knew what they were thinking. This wasn't just another citizen walking into the station. This was a reckoning. Moments later, Hendricks appeared from a back hallway, his stride confident but his expression guarded. He glanced at Michael, then at the desk sergeant, before addressing the room as if to assert control. "What's going on here?" Michael stepped forward, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "We need to talk. Privately." Hendricks raised an eyebrow, feigning nonchalance. "About what?" Michael's lips curved into a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. "About how you've been abusing your badge." The room fell silent. Officers who had been busy moments ago now watched with rapt attention. Hendricks' confidence wavered for a split second before he straightened his posture. "If you've got something to say, you can say it right here." Michael tilted his head, his calm demeanor unwavering. "Fine. Let's talk about the complaints. Excessive force, racial profiling, misconduct. Let's talk about the reports that were mysteriously buried. And let's talk about how you thought you could rip a chain off an innocent man's neck and get away with it." The tension in the room was palpable. Hendricks' face darkened, his jaw tightening as he took a step closer. "I don't know who you think you are," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "but you don't get to walk in here and accuse me of," Michael cut him off. "Save it. I've got enough evidence to make sure you never wear that badge again. You think your connections are going to save you? They won't." Hendricks' bravado faltered. His eyes darted to the officers around him, some of whom now watched him with thinly veiled disdain. "This is a witch hunt," he said, louder now, as if trying to convince the room. "I've done my job, and I've done it well. If anyone's out of line, it's you." Trying to, Michael didn't let him finish. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a flash drive, holding it up for everyone to see. "This drive has everything. Video evidence, witness statements, internal memos. It's over, Hendricks." For the first time, Hendricks looked genuinely rattled. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an ally, but the silence from his colleagues was deafening. The power he had once wielded so effortlessly was slipping through his fingers. Michael stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You could have walked away, Hendricks. But you let your arrogance get the better of you. You thought you were untouchable. Now, you're about to find out just how wrong you were." Before Hendricks could respond, a commanding voice broke the silence. "What the hell is going on in here?" The precinct captain had entered the room, his expression a mix of confusion and annoyance. He looked from Michael to Hendricks, his brows furrowing. "Carter, you want to explain why you're causing a scene in my station?" Michael turned to face the captain, his composure unwavering. "I'm here to hold one of your officers accountable, Captain. Something I'm sure you'd agree is long overdue." The captain's eyes narrowed. "If you've got evidence, you know the procedure. Bring it through the proper channels." Michael took a step back, his voice carrying an edge of finality. "I already have. An internal affairs team is on their way. And when they get here, they're going to find everything they need to take Hendricks down." The room buzzed with whispers as the weight of Michael's words sank in. Hendricks' face turned red, a mix of anger and desperation flashing across his features. "You don't know what you're doing," he spat, his voice trembling. "You think you can just come in here and—" Michael silenced him with a single, pointed look. "This isn't about me, Hendricks. This is about the people you've hurt, the lives you've ruined. You've been hiding behind that badge for too long. But now, you're done." As the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the hallway, Hendricks' facade finally cracked. His shoulders slumped, and for a moment, he looked like a man who knew he had lost. The doors swung open, and a group of internal affairs officers entered, their presence sending a ripple through the room. Michael stepped aside, his work done. He watched as Hendricks was escorted away, the weight of justice finally bearing down on him. But even as the tension in the room began to dissipate, Michael's mind was already racing. This wasn't just about one officer, it was about a system that had allowed him to thrive. As he walked out of the station, the broken chain still in his pocket, Michael knew the fight wasn't over. But for the first time in a long time, it felt like a step in the right direction. And that was enough, for now. As Michael stepped out of the precinct, the weight of the confrontation still lingered in his chest. He inhaled deeply, letting the cool air ground him. His father, James, was waiting in the truck parked a short distance away. The older man sat with his hands resting on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead, lost in thought. Michael opened the passenger door and slid into the seat. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken words and shared pain. Finally, James broke it. "So," he said quietly, not looking at his son, "is it over?" Michael shook his head. "Not yet." James exhaled, the sound more a release of exhaustion than relief. "And what happens now? Does he get a slap on the wrist? A paid vacation? You know how these things go." Michael turned to face his father, his voice steady but laced with conviction. "Not this time, Dad. I made sure of that." James finally looked at him, his expression skeptical but curious. "What do you mean?" Michael pulled the chain from his pocket, holding it carefully in his hand. "I didn't just gather evidence to take him down. I made sure his actions would be exposed in a way he can't escape. The world's going to know what he did, to you, to others. He's not just losing his badge, Dad. He's losing everything." James stared at the chain, the memories it carried etched into his mind. And what does that solve, Michael? It doesn't change what happened. It doesn't stop men like him from existing. No, it doesn't, Michael admitted. But it sends a message. It shows people like him that they can't keep getting away with it. And maybe, just maybe, it makes them think twice before they do it again. James leaned back in his seat, the faintest flicker of hope crossing his features. You really think that's possible? Michael nodded. I have to believe it is. Otherwise, what's the point? The two men sat in silence again, the weight of their shared pain slowly giving way to a sense of quiet resolve. Finally, James reached out and took the chain from Michael's hand. He held it tightly, his fingers brushing over the broken clasp. This chain, James said softly, his voice thick with emotion, it's been through more than most people ever will. And somehow, it's still here. Maybe that's the lesson. Michael looked at his father, his respect for the man deepening with every word. What lesson? That no matter how much they try to break us, we survive, James said, his voice steady now. We keep going. And we make sure the next generation doesn't have to fight the same battles. Michael's throat tightened, but he forced himself to speak. You've done that, Dad. You fought so I could be where I am today. And now it's my turn to fight for you. James smiled faintly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. You've always been a fighter, Michael. Your mother would have been proud. Michael swallowed hard, the mention of his late mother stirring a mix of grief and pride in his chest. I'm proud of you too, Dad. More than you know. They sat there for a moment longer, the bond between them stronger than ever. Then James cleared his throat, his voice returning to its usual steady tone. So, what happens to Hendricks now? Michael's expression hardened. He's going to face justice, real justice. Not just a slap on the wrist. Internal Affairs has everything they need to take him down. And once they're done with him, there won't be a precinct in the country that'll take him. James nodded slowly. Good. He deserves that. He deserves worse, Michael muttered, the anger in his voice barely contained. But this is a start. James reached out, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. Don't let it consume you, Michael. You've done what needed to be done. The rest isn't on you. Michael met his father's gaze, the weight of his words sinking in. I know. But I can't just walk away from this. Not yet. And you won't, James said firmly. But you have to know when to let go. You can't carry the world on your shoulders. Michael nodded reluctantly. I'll try. That's all I ask, James said, his voice softening. Now, let's get out of here. I think we've both had enough of this place. Michael managed a small smile. Agreed. As they drove away from the precinct, the city lights reflecting off the truck's windshield, Michael's mind was already racing. The battle with Hendricks was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead was uncertain, but he knew one thing for sure, he wouldn't stop until justice was served. The fallout from the confrontation at the precinct was swift and far-reaching. By the next morning, the story had already begun to spread, fueled by the power of social media and relentless local reporters who had caught wind of the situation. Clips from the gas station incident resurfaced online, now juxtaposed with footage of Hendricks being escorted out of the precinct by internal affairs officers. For some, it was a moment of vindication, proof that justice could reach even those who wore badges. For others, it was a bitter reminder of how rare accountability truly was. Michael sat at his desk in the FBI field office, scrolling through the countless headlines that now bore Hendricks' name. The officer's history of misconduct, once buried beneath layers of bureaucracy, had been laid bare for the world to see. Each article detailed a pattern of abuse that spanned years, baseless traffic stops, excessive force complaints, and, in one particularly damning case, an incident involving the wrongful arrest of a young black man that had been quietly settled out of court. But what struck Michael most was the growing divide in public opinion. While many praised the exposure of Hendricks' actions, others rallied to his defense, claiming he was the victim of a smear campaign. Comment sections boiled with heated debates, some calling for systemic reform, others dismissing the accusations as exaggerated or politically motivated. Michael couldn't help but feel the weight of it all, the sheer complexity of dismantling a system that had allowed someone like Hendricks to thrive for so long. A knock at his office door pulled him from his thoughts. It was one of his colleagues, Sarah, holding a thick folder in her hands. "Got a minute?" she asked, stepping inside without waiting for an answer. Michael gestured to the chair across from his desk. "What's up?" Sarah placed the folder on the desk and opened it, revealing a stack of documents. "Internal Affairs sent this over. It's the full report on Hendricks. They're moving fast on this, faster than I've ever seen." Michael glanced at the documents, the sheer volume of evidence both satisfying and overwhelming. "Good. They need to. The longer this drags on, the more excuses people will make for him." Sarah nodded, but her expression was somber. "There's something else you should know. Hendricks isn't taking this lying down. His lawyer's already pushing back, claiming the evidence was obtained unlawfully. They're trying to frame this as a personal vendetta." Michael clenched his jaw. "Of course they are. That's all they have left." Sarah hesitated, then added, "There's more. Hendricks has connections, high up. If they decide to back him, this could get ugly." Michael leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He had anticipated resistance, but hearing it aloud made it all the more real. "Let them try," he said finally, his voice steady. "The evidence is solid. They can't argue with the facts." "Maybe not," Sarah said, "but they can muddy the waters enough to make people doubt. And sometimes, that's all it takes." Michael's thoughts turned to his father. James had already been through enough, and the last thing Michael wanted was for this to spiral into a prolonged legal battle that dragged him further into the spotlight. But backing down wasn't an option, not now, not ever. "What about the victims?" Michael asked. "The ones Hendricks targeted. Have they come forward?" Sarah nodded. "A few. One of them, a woman named Angela, reached out directly. She said she's willing to testify, but she's scared." Michael leaned forward. "Scared of what?" "Retaliation," Sarah said plainly. "From Hendricks, from the department, from anyone who doesn't want this case to move forward. You know how it is." Michael's heart sank. He knew all too well how fear could silence people, how the weight of systemic injustice could crush even the bravest souls. "I'll talk to her," he said. "She needs to know she's not alone in this." Sarah gave him a small, encouraging smile. "You're doing the right thing, Michael. Just, be careful. This is bigger than Hendricks. You're taking on an entire system." Michael nodded, the gravity of her words settling over him. "I know. But someone has to." Later that evening, Michael met Angela at a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. She was in her mid-30s, with tired eyes and a cautious demeanor. As they sat across from each other, Michael could sense her apprehension, the way she kept glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone to appear. "I appreciate you meeting me," Michael began, his tone gentle. Angela nodded, her hands gripping the edge of her coffee cup. "I almost didn't come," she admitted. "But then I thought about my son. He's 10. I don't want him growing up in a world where people like Hendricks get to keep doing what they're doing." Michael nodded, his respect for her growing. "You're brave for coming forward. And I promise you, I'll do everything in my power to make sure you're protected." Angela looked at him, her eyes searching his face for sincerity. "Do you really think it'll make a difference? Taking him down?" Yes, Michael said without hesitation. It won't fix everything, but it'll send a message. It'll show people that there are consequences for abuse of power. Angela exhaled, a mix of relief and doubt. I want to believe that. I really do. Michael leaned closer, his voice firm but compassionate. You don't have to do this alone. There are others, people who've been through what you've been through. Together, we can make sure Hendricks is held accountable. Angela nodded slowly, a flicker of determination in her eyes. Okay. I'm in. As they left the cafe, Michael felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about his father or even about Hendricks, it was about everyone who had been silenced, everyone who had been told their pain didn't matter. And as the pieces of the case continued to fall into place, Michael knew one thing for certain: the fight was far from over, but they were gaining ground. The next morning, Michael sat across from his father at the kitchen table. The chain, now repaired, hung loosely around James's neck. It was a small but significant restoration, a piece of dignity returned after days of tension and turmoil. James idly touched the chain as they talked, his fingers tracing the familiar curves of the links. What happens now? James asked, his voice low and tired. His eyes carried the weight of years, a lifetime of similar battles fought on uneven ground. Michael folded his hands in front of him, his gaze steady. Internal Affairs has enough evidence to move forward. Hendricks will face disciplinary action, and if the courts take this seriously, criminal charges. But this isn't just about him anymore. People are starting to talk, about the system, about the culture that let him get away with this for so long. James shook his head, a bitter smile forming on his lips. People have been talking about the system for decades, Michael. Doesn't mean anything changes. Michael's jaw tightened. He wanted to argue, to tell his father that this time was different, but he knew better than to offer empty promises. Instead, he leaned forward, his tone firm. Maybe this won't fix everything, but it's a step. And steps matter, Dad. They add up. James studied his son, his expression softening. You're stubborn. You get that from your mother. Michael smiled faintly, the mention of his mother tugging at his heart. She taught me to fight for what's right. And to never back down, no matter how hard it gets. James nodded slowly. She'd be proud of you. I'm proud of you. Before Michael could respond, his phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen and saw a message from Sarah. Angela's statement is in. It's powerful. He felt a surge of hope. Angela's courage had been a turning point, her testimony a key piece of the puzzle. She did it, Michael said, more to himself than to his father. James raised an eyebrow. Who? Angela, Michael explained. One of Hendricks' victims. She's come forward with her story. It's going to make it a lot harder for him to weasel his way out of this. James leaned back in his chair, a flicker of hope crossing his face. Well, I'll be damned. Maybe there's a chance after all. Michael's phone buzzed again, this time a call. He answered, his tone shifting to professional. Carter. Sarah's voice came through the line, urgent but steady. We've got a problem. Michael frowned. What kind of problem? Hendricks, Sarah said. He's not going down quietly. His lawyers already filed motions to suppress some of the evidence, and they're trying to discredit Angela's statement. It's messy, Michael. Michael's grip on the phone tightened. What about Internal Affairs? Do they have enough to hold him? For now, Sarah said. But it's getting complicated. Hendricks has friends in high places, and they're starting to push back. Michael exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. I'll be at the office in 20 minutes. We'll figure this out. When he hung up, James was watching him closely. What's going on? Hendricks is fighting back, Michael said. He's got connections, people who are trying to protect him. James scoffed, his expression darkening. Of course he does. That's how this works. Michael stood, grabbing his jacket. Not this time. Not if I can help it. James reached out, placing a hand on Michael's arm. Be careful, son. You're playing a dangerous game. Michael met his father's gaze, the resolve in his eyes unwavering. It's worth it. At the FBI office, Michael and Sarah pored over the case files, searching for any gaps Hendricks' team might exploit. The pressure was mounting, but Michael refused to let it shake him. This was about more than one man, it was about a system that needed to be held accountable. He's going to argue that Angela's statement is biased, Sarah said, flipping through a stack of papers. They're claiming she's only coming forward because she has a personal grudge. Michael frowned. And the video evidence? The complaints from other victims? They can't ignore all of that. They'll try, Sarah said. But we've got something they don't, the truth. And we need to make sure it's impossible to ignore. Michael leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. We need more voices. If we can show a pattern of behavior, it'll be harder for them to dismiss this as an isolated incident. Sarah nodded. I've been reaching out to other victims. Some are hesitant, but a few are willing to talk. It's a start. Michael's phone buzzed again, a message from an unknown number. He opened it and froze. It was a photo of his father's truck, parked outside their house, taken from an angle that suggested the sender had been standing nearby. What is it? Sarah asked, noticing the change in his expression. Michael showed her the photo. A warning. Sarah's eyes widened. Hendricks? Or someone working for him, Michael said, his voice tight. They're trying to scare me off. What are you going to do? Sarah asked. Michael's jaw set in determination. I'm going to keep going. They're scared because they know they're losing. Later that evening, Michael returned home to find his father waiting for him on the porch. James stood with his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the street as if keeping watch. Got something to tell me? James asked as Michael approached. Michael hesitated, then pulled out his phone and showed his father the photo. I didn't want to worry you. James studied the image, his expression unreadable. They're trying to intimidate you. I know, Michael said. But it's not going to work. James shook his head, a mix of frustration and admiration in his eyes. You're braver than I was at your age. Michael placed a hand on his father's shoulder. You taught me to stand up for what's right. That's all I'm doing. James nodded, his resolve matching his son's. Then we stand together. They won't break us. As they stood on the porch, the night air heavy with unspoken threats, Michael felt a renewed sense of purpose. The battle wasn't over, but they were ready for whatever came next. Together, they would see this fight through to the end. The night was eerily quiet as Michael sat at the small desk in his father's living room, a mountain of papers and his laptop glowing faintly in the dimly lit space. His focus was unbroken, despite the exhaustion pulling at his mind. Each file he opened revealed another piece of the intricate puzzle that Hendricks had left behind, victims silenced, reports altered, and colleagues complicit in maintaining his power. James sat nearby in his recliner, the soft creak of the chair the only sound in the room. The gold chain rested around his neck once more, a silent symbol of the fight they were both entrenched in. His eyes were on Michael, filled with a mix of pride and concern. You haven't slept, have you? James asked, his voice breaking the silence. Michael didn't look up, his fingers tapping rapidly on the keyboard. I'll sleep when this is over. James leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. It's never really over, son. You can win battles like this, but the war. It keeps going. Michael finally turned to face his father, his expression firm. That doesn't mean we stop fighting. James sighed, shaking his head. I just don't want to see this eat away at you. You're doing more than most would ever dare. Don't lose yourself in the process. Michael softened, nodding slightly. I won't. But this, what Hendricks did, it's personal, Dad. He humiliated you, and he's done the same to so many others. Someone has to make sure he pays for it. James tilted his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. You've got your mother's fire, that's for sure. Michael smiled back, but the moment was cut short by the buzzing of his phone. He grabbed it from the desk, his eyes narrowing as he read the text. Angela's house was broken into. She's okay, but she's scared. Michael stood abruptly, grabbing his jacket. James noticed the change immediately. What's wrong? Angela, Michael said. Someone's trying to intimidate her. James got to his feet. Let me come with you. No, Michael said quickly, shaking his head. You stay here. I need to know you're safe. James hesitated, clearly torn, but he nodded. Be careful, Michael. Michael gave his father a reassuring look before stepping out into the night. Angela was sitting at her kitchen table when Michael arrived, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. The front door, now fitted with a temporary lock, bore the scars of forced entry. She looked up as Michael walked in, her eyes red-rimmed but resolute. They didn't take anything, she said before he could ask. They just trashed the place. Made sure I knew they'd been here. Michael sat across from her, his expression calm but his voice laced with anger. Do you have any idea who it could have been? Angela shook her head. Could have been anyone. Hendricks has friends in the department, people who'd do anything to protect him. Michael leaned forward, his voice softening. Angela, I know this is hard, but you're doing something incredibly brave. Don't let them scare you into silence. Angela's grip on the mug tightened. It's not me I'm worried about. It's my son. What if they come back? What if they hurt him? Michael placed a reassuring hand on hers. They won't. I'll make sure of it. We're putting protective measures in place for you and your family. Angela's lip trembled, but she held back her tears. I don't regret coming forward, Michael. But I didn't realize how much it would cost. Michael nodded, his admiration for her growing. The truth is always expensive. But it's worth it. What you're doing could change everything, not just for you, but for everyone Hendricks has hurt. Angela's resolve hardened, and she nodded. Then I'll keep going. No matter what. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. More victims came forward, bolstered by Angela's courage. Each testimony added to the growing mountain of evidence against Hendricks, painting a damning picture of a man who had long operated above the law. But Hendricks wasn't going down without a fight. His lawyer held press conferences, spinning the narrative as one of a hard-working officer being targeted in a politically motivated smear campaign. News outlets picked up the story, and the public's response was as polarized as ever. Michael watched one such press conference on the television in his office, his jaw tightening as Hendricks' lawyer spoke with calculated confidence. This is nothing more than an attempt to destroy the reputation of a decorated officer, the lawyer said. We will prove that these allegations are baseless and driven by personal vendettas. Michael turned off the TV, his frustration bubbling to the surface. Sarah, who was sitting across from him, gave him a sympathetic look. They're grasping at straws, she said. They know they're losing. Michael shook his head. It doesn't matter. As long as they can create doubt, they'll keep fighting. Sarah leaned forward, her expression determined. Then we fight harder. What's next? Michael exhaled, running a hand through his hair. We need to make sure the victims feel supported. If Hendricks' team tries to intimidate them, we push back twice as hard. Sarah nodded. I'll reach out to the community advocacy groups. They can help keep the pressure on. Michael gave her a grateful look. Thanks, Sarah. I don't know how I'd do this without you. She smiled faintly. You'd find a way. You always do. As the case moved forward, the pressure on Hendricks mounted. His once loyal colleagues began to distance themselves, some even coming forward with their own stories of his misconduct. The walls were closing in, and it was clear to everyone that his days of unchecked power were numbered. One evening, Michael received a call from Internal Affairs. The lead investigator, a seasoned officer named Ramirez, had news. We're moving to formally charge Hendricks, Ramirez said. The evidence is overwhelming, and we have enough testimony to back it up. Michael felt a surge of relief. That's good to hear. There's one more thing, Ramirez added. Hendricks has requested a meeting with you. Michael froze. With me? Why? He says he has something to say. It's up to you if you want to hear it. Michael hesitated, his mind racing. Finally, he nodded. Set it up. The meeting was held in a small, sterile room at the precinct. Hendricks sat across from Michael, his demeanor a mix of defiance and desperation. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Hendricks leaned forward, his voice low. You think you've won, don't you? He said, his eyes narrowing. You think taking me down will fix everything? Michael met his gaze, his expression unflinching. I think it's a start. Hendricks scoffed. You don't get it, do you? I'm not the problem. The system is. And no matter what you do to me, it's still going to be there. Michael's jaw tightened. Maybe you're right. But taking you down sends a message, that the system can't protect people like you forever. Hendricks leaned back, a bitter smile on his face. You think you're a hero. But all you're doing is scratching the surface. Michael stood, his voice firm. And that's more than you ever did. As he walked out of the room, Hendricks' words lingered in his mind. But Michael knew one thing for certain, the fight wasn't over, but the tide was turning. The courtroom was silent as the judge read the verdict. Hendricks sat at the defense table, his face pale and drawn. The jury had deliberated for days, but the evidence was overwhelming. One by one, the charges were read aloud: abuse of power, falsifying reports, and misconduct under the color of law. Guilty. 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 The final word rang out in the room like a bell, signaling the end of an era for the man who had long considered himself untouchable. Michael stood in the back of the courtroom, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. The relief was immense, but it was tempered by the knowledge of how much it had taken to get here. His father, James, sat beside him, his shoulders squared and his expression unreadable. When the sentencing was announced, 10 years without parole, forfeiture of pension, and permanent disqualification from holding any law enforcement position, James let out a long, slow breath. As they walked out of the courtroom, the sunlight streaming through the tall glass windows, James finally spoke. It's done. Michael glanced at his father. Not all of it. But this was a step. James nodded slowly. You're right. It's a start. In the weeks that followed, the fallout from the case spread far beyond Hendricks. His conviction had opened the door to broader scrutiny of the department, exposing systemic issues that had long been swept under the rug. Several officers resigned under pressure, and new policies were implemented to address the failures that had allowed Hendricks to operate unchecked for so many years. Angela, the brave woman who had come forward despite her fears, found herself at the center of a growing movement for accountability. Her voice inspired others to share their stories, and she became a local advocate for police reform, her name now synonymous with resilience and courage. Michael continued his work at the FBI, but the case had left a lasting mark on him. He found himself increasingly drawn to cases involving abuse of power, using his position to ensure that others like Hendricks were brought to justice. The satisfaction he felt wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal, a way to honor the sacrifices his father had made and the values his mother had instilled in him. One evening, as Michael sat with James on the porch of their home, the sun dipping low on the horizon, James broke the comfortable silence. "You did good, son." Michael smiled faintly. "So did you. You stood your ground when it mattered most." James touched the chain around his neck, the gold links catching the light. "This chain, it's more than a memory now. It's proof that we can fight back. That we can win." Michael leaned back, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's not over, Dad. There's still so much to do." James nodded. "There always will be. But the next generation? They'll have something we didn't. A story of what's possible when we don't back down." As the weeks turned into months, the Carter name became a symbol of hope in their community. People stopped James on the street to thank him for standing up to Hendricks, for being a part of something bigger than himself. Michael's work continued to make waves, his relentless pursuit of justice inspiring others to take a stand. But the true victory lay in the quiet moments, the knowledge that they had made a difference not just for themselves, but for countless others who had suffered in silence. To those of you who have been with us on this journey, let's take a moment to reflect. This story wasn't just about a corrupt officer or a brave father and son, it was about the power of resilience, the importance of standing up against injustice, and the difference we can make when we refuse to stay silent. How many times have we witnessed or experienced moments of injustice and thought, this is just how the world is? Stories like this remind us that it doesn't have to be. Change is hard, and it's slow, but it starts with people like James and Michael, people who refuse to accept the unacceptable. What about you? What would you do if faced with a moment like this? Would you stand your ground, even when the odds are against you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's start a conversation about what it means to fight for what's right, no matter how daunting the challenge. If you found this story powerful, if it moved you or inspired you, please subscribe to Tales of Twist for more stories like this. Hit that like button, share the video, and let's keep these conversations alive. Together, we can be the change we want to see in the world. Thank you for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.